Area Historical Society. Okay, as always, on the piano, we have a donation jar, which we would hope and anticipate you're able to give us some funds for our ongoing programs. Also, we have membership forms, which gets you the newsletter. I talked to one or two tonight that need to sign up for that because they don't use computers. And we also have a volunteer form that we're going to put there each program. Now, people always say, what can we do to help? Well, we now have a list of things, and Don Horning last month went over that. So we're going to have that list of helpful things that you could do. Maybe one of those fits what you can help us with. This is our last meeting until September, and it's September 19th. We're not sure what the topic is yet, but Mitch is our program guy, and I'm sure he'll come up with something very interesting. Last month and a month before that, I was saying I'm very excited for tonight's program. I have read Jack Brubaker's columns forever, never met the man till tonight. Now that's a bucket list thing for me. I'm very happy. So I've been advertising this a lot on Facebook that tonight was the program. So I'm going to turn this over to Don Horning now.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's safe to say Jack Brubaker doesn't need any introductions, but I will introduce Christine Conant Brubaker, and you can put two and two together and figure out who she is. They are husband and wife, and we'll hear more about how they met, when they met, and their pilgrimage to get from where they were to where they are tonight. Here we are, Jack and Christine. 1 year and a couple months ago, we were driving through the Welsh Mountains, and I don't know what made me say this, because I probably wasn't sure of myself a couple times since then, but I said, have you ever told your story? And Christine chuckled from the back seat, because she said, well, and I said, why are you chuckling? And she said, well, I think I have this right, that our kids have him doing Storyworth. How many people know what Storyworth is? Oh, just a couple people. It's where it's a forced march by your kids to tell your story when you don't think you want to tell your story. And I said, well, let's talk about doing this. And so that began a dialogue. I will tell you that here we are tonight. I've never done this, and the Brubakers have never done it. So help us out. Stay awake and have lots of questions at the end. I'd like to both have you start out by telling us where you were born, just quickly, where you were born and some of your early years in primary school and high school. And let's just start with Chris. And see, even though it's, yes, I know it's Jack's night, but I'm going to start with you because you were not born at the duck farm.
No, but I'm a lucky duck to have married him. All right. We have to go home together tonight. Just remember that. My story isn't exactly as happy as possible, but it's the truth. I was born in Santa Barbara, California. Due to World War II, my father was sent there. He was a Marine on a Navy ship named the USS Franklin. He was a captain in charge of the airplanes and the pilots. 60 miles from Japan, the ship was kamikazed, and he was burned to death since he was below deck with the airplane fuel and the planes when the Japanese kamikaze gentleman pilot dropped the bomb that rolled into the flight deck. So that was not a happy beginning, but that is my beginning.
Did your upbringing at all predict your career path where you might have gone later?
My mother was a French and business major in college, and I'll get into that later. And when she was widowed, I didn't see all the struggle, but I became aware of it, that she wanted to earn a good living, and she wanted to help me on my personal schedule, which was the school schedule. And so she went back for 4 years and got another degree, this time in early childhood education. Why? Because the University of Toledo would not give her any credit for any of her prior academic work. Pretty strict back then. And that's how she became an early childhood education teacher, and then we'll get into that later.
And Jack, the duck farm, tell us about, I think you had a column recently that talked about the duck farm.
I did, about the Gibbons family who originally owned that land
Speak up.
and ran. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working, but you're not.
We'll put it up for you.
It was originally an underground railroad station run by the Gibbons family, 3 generations during the 19th century. And then the Brubakers intermarried with the Gibbonses, and the Brubakers and Gibbonses started a duck farm, which is very famous at the time, not so famous now, 64 years after it closed. How many people here even know about the Brubaker duck farm at Bird in Hand? I know you do.
Yeah.
2 or 3, 4 or 5. When I first started giving talks, almost everybody would raise their hands. It was a big deal.
And it was on the, was a photo, was on the cover of Life magazine, which made it
That's true.
a big deal.
So I grew up in Bird in Hand, but I want to diverge from there a little bit. I had 2 places I went from Bird in Hand. One was to Lancaster, where my mother's parents lived, on Woods Avenue. And the other was to New Holland. I spent a lot of time in New Holland when I was a kid. I learned to swim in the New Holland pool. We came to the New Holland pool every day, almost, with my mom and when my little sisters came along. We came here for the parades, and I sat on the front porch of Dick and Helen Brubaker. How many people knew them? And of course, you knew Ann Tennis and
Charlie and Ann.
pardon me?
John and Ann.
John and Ann
Right.
Tennis, for their children who lived here. The other thing I want to tell you is my Brubakers settled just west of here along New Holland Road, where Mill Creek crosses there. Their farm, is this still working? Yeah. Okay. Their farm was on Mill Creek near New Holland Road. The farm is still there, it's been subdivided, but that's where they settled in the 1720s. They went to Trinity Lutheran Church here in New Holland. They were the only Brubakers who were Lutherans. All the other Brubakers who settled in the central part of Lancaster County were Mennonites. So that's the distinction. I thought you'd find that curious.
The Germanic background between the Lutherans and the Mennonites was
Legendary, because I know many marriages that had one from either church, because it was more a matter of availability. Did anything you grew up with in your early years inform you as to where you went? Did you have any inherent interest in history things, or did that develop later? History and heritage and older things, anything at all? Or was your childhood just the typical exploring and growing?
Well, I grew up on what was once 1,000 acres owned by the Gibbonses. The Underground Railroad station was still there at that time. I was surrounded by history. The Gibbonses were writers. They kept everything, all their diaries, all their letters, most of which we have now given to the Lancaster history. They had a huge box of Liberty and other anti-slavery newspapers, maybe 1,000 newspapers in a big box up in the attic. So I grew up with all this old stuff all around me. The other formative influence was in 3rd grade. I had a teacher who somehow discovered that I was interested in Robert E. Lee. And so she gave me a book about Lee. And then she gave me a book about other, little books, short books about famous people. And she got me involved in biography and history. She's the only teacher until high school who emphasized history that really made sense to me. So I give her a lot of credit. Elsie Huber was her name.
And your college of choice and your major?
I went to Dickinson College after Conestoga Valley High School. And my major was English, not history. Most of my friends majored in history. I did not, because I did not get along well with the chairman of the history department. And I won't go into why that happened. So I majored in English. They're very similar subjects. I know a lot of English professors who write about history, and some history professors write about biographies of writers. So
Yeah, that's good. And your college of choice and your major, and did you use your major immediately after college?
Because I'm a World War II war orphan, I was able to have a scholarship, we'll call it, to any place that I wanted to go. And I eventually chose Miami of Ohio, where I learned fairly quickly that I would not be a burden to my mother financially, because that World War II scholarship fund would pay for 90% of my tuition. And so if you ask me if I'm a supporter of the military benefits to war orphans, of course, the answer is yes. Did I abuse that? No.
And Jack, I think you told me that all English majors have this dream of someday being the next Hemingway or Michener and would like to write fiction. Did I catch that correctly?
I don't know about all, but I did.
Yeah. Tell me just a few of your writings along that line. I think you told me you did some plays and some fiction.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of plays, which we had bench readings of them at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. That's about as far as it went. I was told that they were bench read at New York University too, but I wasn't there. I wrote some short stories, sent them off to magazines, and nobody published them. And I was spinning my wheels, and at age 26, my college roommate was getting his doctorate in history, and I was still spinning my wheels. And he said, "Why don't you go write for a newspaper?" Which I had never considered. He said, "A newspaper will make you write every day, and they will make you write something that makes sense, unlike the stuff you're writing now." He never did like my plays or my fiction. So I did. And I started in Danville, Virginia, and then came home.
We'll talk about the coming home a little bit later. And what did you do with your education? What was your first job? I didn't make note of that.
Well, let's back up a little bit. What I haven't said, and I would like to say, is that my upbringing was very different from Jack's. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. At that time in my life, and we're the same age, six months apart. Che Guevara. Well, let's back up. Preschool for me was because my mother needed to put me someplace while she continued her education for her degree. So that's done. Then I, during K through 8 degrees, just had what I would call a normal childhood. However, when I got out of high school, out of K through 8, the world changed for me, and for you, perhaps. depending on where you lived. I was bused on a city bus and had to transfer twice for 3 years to a school that I did not know, was not in my neighborhood, and was quasi-integrated. The part that I remember is that because I was college prep, my high school classes were not what I would call fully integrated. However, the school had issues, severe issues, one of which was guns in the locker. And therefore, I could not participate in school activities. I could not stay after school. I could not go to sporting events because of the issues of safety for children. So therefore, you can imagine that I relate to the issues of children in today's society very strongly. And obviously, I want to protect the children. When I was given a chance to go to a new high school very close to where my home was, I and others said yes. And it allowed me to blossom in new ways. You know, I became editor of the newspaper. I worked very hard on issues that seemed to make sense at the time, that allowed me to speak up. I participated in a county-wide government youth program. So instead of feeling oppressed, I blossomed, and I'm very happy that I had that chance.
So I think you're seeing a pattern here of two lives that are very different. The duck farm is a long way from the city. And
I really wasn't in the city except for my high school years.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that taught me, and my mother, by the way, was director of early childhood education for the whole damn county. Forgive my French. But you know, here we are on municipal little boundary circles, not Lancaster County circles of education. So her responsibility was not only kindergartens in all the county schools, but also the migrant education program during the summer. She was one busy woman.
So you had a college management position, president, chancellor. Do I have the right name?
Because I saw my mother struggling, not because she made me see it, but because I'm observant, struggling to have a career, have a life, have a profession, things like that. I knew instinctively that the way to go forward for my own health and safety was to be cognizant of how education can be an important tool in your life. And therefore, in college, I double majored in English and communications, which may sound silly to you, but communications gave me the opportunity for majoring in journalism and TV and other forms of media. So it was a good secondary backup to being a staid English teacher. So then when I went to college, I got a graduate assistantship, was in a dorm that paid for my tuition. And I double majored again, because why not? So one of my majors was college administration, and the other one was secondary guidance. And you never know how these tools are going to be useful in your life. Later, I'll tell you how.
It strikes me that you probably never dreamed that someday you'd live in the garden spot of the world, like
My mother had a small garden plot. She dragged me to all the nurseries, but no, you're right.
Yeah, no tractors.
I will tell you this, that when I went back for my high school reunion one year, I've been back several times, but the one year, do you remember when the economic problems were really huge and people were having to sell their homes or kind of die? I went back to Toledo because Toledo had an industrial background. Libby owns Ford, Toledo, glass, etc. And a lot of families were losing their homes. And I went back unknowing to that about my high school reunion. because I belong to the Lancaster Bike Club, you're not going to believe this, but you ready? I had signed up for the Covered Bridge bike ride, which is their annual event. And I got on my bike with a friend that I knew, and I was pedaling, for not very long, and I burst into tears. And she said, "Why are you crying?" And I thought, I don't even know. But it was so beautiful in the garden spot with all the flowers and all the tidy homes and none of the signs for foreclosure in their front yards like Toledo had. And in Toledo, they even had bus tours for foreclosures for people who wanted to buy homes. Here, I was on a bike riding through Grandview Heights and other places, and the flowers were blooming, and the contrast was overwhelming to the point where I said, I just burst into tears. I said, "You guys don't know how good you have it here." And I mean that even today.
So, as we get towards the time of the Scribbler, which we'll arrive at shortly, family arrived before you moved to Lancaster County. Is that correct?
1 out of 2.
1 out of 2.
Yeah.
Okay. So family changed a bit for you because you gave up your career. Eventually to raise the family.
I was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years.
She was a stay-at-home mom. So a person with education and degree, and you felt that the most important job at that time was to raise a family.
And he agreed.
Raise him too.
No, he agreed to that. There's been a bit of that, but we won't get into that. Yes, I was very blessed to be able to stay at home, and I would do it again. However, I will say that in that time, I became a board member with the Lancaster Mental Health Association, Warnersville Mental Health Hospital, the Lancaster County Drug and Alcohol Mental Health Board, president of Lancaster County Conservancy. The list goes on. A League of Women Voters, ridiculous amounts of pro bono work. But because I could work it into his schedule and the kids' schedule, and it made me intellectually stimulated and get to know the community. Come on, wasn't born and raised here. I packed lunches with the kids and found another mother, and we'd stick them in the car and go visit, outdoor places and see things and do things. And it wasn't a bad time in my life.
Take us on a quick trip now from, you were Virginia, correct? Danville, Virginia. Take us on a quick trip from there to Lancaster County. How did the call come? Were you looking for, were your aspirations not being met, your goals, then you looked for something different? What called you to this area?
Back again.
What's that?
Well,
Back again.
Yeah. Yes, back again, exactly.
this is more than a little tedious, but I was writing in Danville, Virginia as a general assignment reporter. And it was a very small newspaper, and the editor didn't really assign people to beat, so I just made up the college beat because I wanted to meet girls. Stratford College was a really good women's college in Danville, Virginia. And I hung around that college to get the news and to get the girls. But I knew one of Christine's employees. She was dean of students at Stratford College, probably one of the youngest deans in the country. And I would never have thought of asking out the dean of students, but her employee said I should, so I did. And
The rest is history.
the rest.
He invited me to go to a cemetery on our first date. I was not prepared for that kind of an introduction to a friendship. And there was a death in my family, and the date didn't happen. Sad to say.
So I went to a different cemetery. Anyway, we dated for a couple of years, fell in love and got married. Meanwhile, I came back to Lancaster, worked here. We got married. Chris came up here and worked for Franklin Marshall College as an admissions officer for a year. And then I got offered a job in Danville as assistant and then editor of the newspaper. And I went there, and that was a bad mistake, and I'm not going to go into that. So we came back to Lancaster the second time. And we came back here in '78 when our daughter was 6 weeks old. And we came back here, and we've been here ever since.
Well, this begins then the era of Jack Brubaker, the Scribbler. It's the beginning of what's going to lead to that. I think people would like to hear a little bit about the Scribbler, because the Scribbler started in 1919, I believe you told me. Which this was a surprise to me that this particular column has been in effect since 1919. So we're 100 and whatever. I can't do math when I'm sitting up front.
105 years old. It was actually started 105 years ago next Friday. Happy birthday to the column. So yeah, it's been going for 105 years, but I have not written it all that time.
Yeah. Did you have aspirations of taking on the Scribbler when you moved up here, or did that just evolve after you got here?
I read the Scribbler as a teenager, and I thought it was a cool column. It was an easy way to learn something about local history and culture, and sometimes humorous. Jerry Lest. Does anybody remember the name Jerry Lest? Does anybody know Jerry Lest?
L-E-S-T-Z.
L-E-S-T-Z.
Yeah.
Jerry Lest. Turk, you?
Jerry was a friend of my mother's.
Oh, yeah, okay. Turk Pierce's mother knew Jerry Lest, and Don knew Jerry
I knew the
Lest.
column. I mean, I knew his name as an editor and writer.
He wrote it before I did for about 20 years. Anyway, where was I going with that? So I read his columns when I was a teenager and liked them. But I never thought I would become the Scribbler. I just thought it was a neat column. So I came up to Lancaster to work, got to know the editor of the Lancaster New Era, who was then Dan Cherry. And when things went sour in Danville, I talked to Dan, and he said, why don't you come back here? And you can replace Jerry Lest, who was retiring. So we came up in 1978, and I worked for a year as a copy editor, then Jerry retired, and I took over working on the editorial page and writing the Scribbler in 1979. So I've written the column for 45 years.
Allows me to edit his columns sometimes because my role is to say, well, I wasn't born and raised here, dear, and I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Right.
You could clarify it, and he's allowed me to do that.
I encourage her to do it.
I've never seen him, though, put a little note at the end, edited by Christine.
No, I get photo credits
Do you
sometimes.
get? Okay. Yeah, I know you took photographs
She
when I was
takes
with
my
you.
photos, she does the editing. She was the newspaper editor in high school. I never cared about newspapers. I didn't care one whit about newspapers until I went to work for one. I read them occasionally, but I didn't ever consider it as a career. She was way ahead of me, still is.
I have identified, and I think correctly, that the Scribbler has two meanings. And I wrote that in, I don't know if it was picked up by any of the publicity people that we talked about, but the Scribbler has two meanings. One, it means the column, but the other, it means Jack Brubaker. And I don't know that I've ever seen a column that the persona of the column is the editor and back and forth like that. I don't know that anybody's ever taken a column. Is it safe to say the column before you was not quite like that when the other editors had it?
No, it wasn't at all. Jerry Lest wrote the column using the pronoun we, which was the editorial we. it carried over to the column. So when he would discuss art and so on, he would say, we saw this or we saw that. Well, I started off with that and I didn't like it. So I changed to he. I changed the pronoun to the third person. So the scribbler became the scribbler, he, the scribbler. And that is called, does anyone know what a person who refers to himself in the third person rather than I as he, do you know what that's called? No, I didn't either until a former classmate of mine told me several years ago. I am an Iliest, I-L-I-E-S-T.
Not elitist.
No, no, it's an Iliest. Very obscure word. You'll probably never hear that again. So I am the scribbler writing the Scribbler column, and I make sure everybody at the newspaper understands that when I refer to myself as the scribbler, it's lowercase t, the scribbler, but the column is uppercase T, the scribbler. It's my distinction. I don't know whether anybody else cares.
Well, I thought it made sense when we talked about it. Yeah.
Okay, you care.
And Christine, we're going to be talking about your famous husband, but you should correct him when he's wrong here. You will do that if he wanders off the reservation here. So
He's been very gracious about letting me read and play the dumb reader role.
what was it like to have the ownership of a column? Because no other editor in the paper has the ownership of a column. Did that somehow or other give you some feeling of confidence, some license to ask questions of people because you are the Scribbler?
I think I'm one of the most fortunate newspaper guys in the world because I'm allowed to write about anything I want to write about. Sometimes you'll read something offbeat and you'll say, that doesn't sound like a Scribbler column. Well, that's because I wanted to write about it. I can write about anything I want. I have not been censored. I have been edited by my wife and by editors at Lancaster newspapers, but not heavily. And I'm really lucky in that way. That if it strikes me as an interesting thing, that's what I'll write about. It's a great way to earn a living.
Were there scary moments that you can...
I'm in here too. Were there any scary moments at the outset where this ownership of this column also brings with it a responsibility to make it work, and it's just you. It's just you that has to make it work. You can't rely on other people within the newspaper organization to do research. I'm assuming you do all your own research, or did you hit the ground running and you knew you could make this work?
I sort of hit the ground running because I wrote 4 columns about the history of the Scribbler column, going back to the very beginning and the various people who wrote the column and some of the takeouts from the columns that were most interesting. And I ran those for the first 2 weeks because at that time the Scribbler ran twice a week. So those 4 columns were done. And it was good that they were done because the first one appeared on April 4th, 1979. Does anybody in this room remember what else was happening on April 4th, 1979? TMI. I started my column right in the middle of that mess. And the newsroom, well, that was before you came, Turk, right? Yeah. But you were over in York.
No, I was in Elmwood City then.
Elwood City, okay. Well, it would have been, that was a little farther away, but anybody who was with a newspaper in this area knows how nuts it was. It was just absolutely crazy. So I was glad I had those first columns written. I could concentrate on other stuff. But scary things, I'll say this. One of the scariest things that happened to me when I started writing the column was Chris and I went to a cocktail party maybe a month after I started writing it. And a woman came up to me and she looked me up and down. Now she was an older, she was my age or older, an older Lancastrian who, I mean, a real Lancaster person. And she was very fond of Jerry Lest. And she looked me up and down and she said, "You have large shoes to fill." And I felt about that small, and my shoes felt even smaller. But I made it. And the other thing that happened was one of the reporters at that time, Jack Moore, when I first wrote a column that was just one column about one subject. Jerry Lest never did that. He did 3 or 4 items in a column, and I still do that at times. But I wrote one column about one subject, and Jack came up to me and he said, "That wasn't a Scribbler column. You can't do that." And I said, "It's my column now." I thought that was a very brave and stupid thing to say to an older reporter, but those are things that stuck in my mind, that stick in my mind as being challenges at the beginning.
As a life partner of somebody is doing something new like that, did you intercede in discussions then already, or is your editorial expertise come later as he matured as a writer of the column? Or were you?
He would not have let me read his or edit his early works.
Okay.
And I would have never asked because I was too busy with my roles as a mother and so forth. And I wasn't, as someone who had been a newspaper editor of a high school paper, but, I was not someone who also was asked, even then, to share what I was writing. And back then, I have to tell you, the topics were brutal because we had separated from a school that was kind of racially charged to a all-white school, and how dare we do that? So my workload as a student writer was something like what Jack later, had to do and be involved with, which is reading the audience, reading the public, reading the administration. And I had a few tears with the school principal because I felt that pressure. And he kept a box of Kleenex on the side of his desk. I thought that was sweet. Because, there were times when I wasn't quite qualified, of course, to understand the circumstances of the world around me.
So now we have a cadence going. You're writing the column. You've survived the lady telling you that you have large shoes to fill, and you're on your way, and you are helping with the family, helping him be free to do the things he has to do. The breadth of the subject matter that you have, is that intentional or is it happenstance? Because you go, I think, proverbial from soup to nuts with your subject matter. Did that evolve, or was that an intentional also to just kind of go all over the map? And also, maybe attendant to that is you take suggestions and from your readership, which is unusual too. I as an editor of a newspaper, you probably had to do the content. You weren't taking suggestion from somebody. You ought to look into that because you had to have an agenda you followed. Yours is a much more freewheeling. Tell me about the breadth and how you go from the color of mailboxes to whatever,
Right.
Or the Welsh Mountains.
Or the Welsh Mountains. Yeah, we go to the Welsh Mountains. That's where we started. So just that whole breadth of subject matter. We'll talk about now what you decide to write about. And almost you get whiplash from one week to another. So tell me about that.
Well, Jerry Lest had a great variety in his columns, so I really just picked up on that. So Jack Moore, the reporter, told me that wasn't a Scribbler column, was in a sense wrong. I have continued to write about everything from soup to nuts. I just don't write short things all the time because I think some stories deserve more words.
You have varied approaches as well to the column. You go history, heritage, customs, societal customs, humor, veiled sarcasm. May I put that in there?
Yes.
Does this format contribute to the success and the loyal readership that you have garnered over the years, that they don't know what to expect each time they turn open the paper?
I hear that, so it must be true. And I think that's good. I know everybody doesn't read every column. I wouldn't read some of my columns. I mean, seriously, I've gone back and looked at some of my columns and I've said, you know, that was probably not a good week. But most of the things I write about, I have to be interested in, because if I'm not interested, I'm not going to interest anybody else. So, yeah, where am I going?
Well, just where the varied approach to your column and how, and some subject matter, I suppose, lends itself to humor and other to seriousness. And so you can't have one mode of editorship. You have to move with your kind of your feelings have to go with the story.
Yeah, everything changes according to the story. Some stories tell themselves. Some stories I have to work at. Now, up until 8, 9 years ago, the Scribbler column was on the editorial page. So I often editorialized in my column. I wrote many columns about Route 23, the bypass idea. You know, I didn't like it. I don't know whether anybody in this room does like it, but don't tell me. I detest the idea, and I don't even like the mile that they've done now. I think it's still just a way of getting that road up to Morgantown so we can get more development up through this valley. Well, I've gotten off on that track. But I did editorialize a lot then about various items. I don't do so much now. I sneak in some editorializing when I can, but I try not to because I'm on the news pages and I should be more objective, although columnists have more free reign than the news reporters do.
Most interesting people you've met? A couple people that you might have met along the way. And if nothing comes to your mind, I won't belabor it, but just...
The most interesting person I know in Lancaster County is Jim McMullen. Those of you who have read my column for years probably remember seeing his name pop up. Not so much anymore because he's now 96 years old. He's still very spry and intellectually sharp, but he doesn't come up with so many ideas anymore. But I used to use him all the time. He was a city police lieutenant who became a detective. He got to know everybody and everything in Lancaster County. He was like Jerry Lest, who could tell you everybody in every building, who lived in every building, and so on and so on. Jim McMullen knows everything. So when I don't know something, he's one of the people I go to first. Another guy is Sam Stolzfus, who's my Amish contact in Gordonville. And he is a real character. He's an Amish reporter, and he's almost always correct. And he really knows what's going on in the Amish community. And he's willing to talk about it, and his bishop is willing to let him talk about it. Those two, I guess because they're my two best sources, are the most interesting people I know. I keep going back to them because they know things that I don't know. And that's interesting to me.
Most depressing story you had to write about or that you came upon, something that drove you down.
I wrote some of this down.
And again, if you don't have them at the tip of your tongue,
well,
we're not going to belabor this.
I've written about the Conestoga Massacre by the Paxton boys about, in many, many columns over the years. Probably in long columns or short pieces, 50 times. I wrote a book about the Conestoga Massacre, partly because I laid the first columns I wrote about the massacre side by side when I was putting together a book of Scribbler columns. And I said, these columns don't make sense, they're different. And the reason was I was looking at different sources each time. The story changes depending on who you read. So I said, I'm going to write my own book about it and try to get it right. And in large part, I hope I did.
How many people in the audience were here when he made his presentation of that? What, the past year?
Maybe 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah. So it was quite a good presentation.
Well, that is a depressing story to me, and it remains a depressing story to the Native Americans that Chris and I know through a group called Circle Legacy in Lancaster. It's a group of American Indians and Indian sympathizers who promote their culture in Lancaster and nearby counties. And those people still deeply care about what happened in 1763 in Lancaster County. So I'd say that's one of the most depressing stories I've written about in my column, in my book, and that I talk about with Indians even today. The other most depressing thing I ever wrote, I think, was on Tuesday. It was on a Tuesday, and I was still writing on the editorial page. And I wrote one of the first columns in the state calling on Joe Paterno to resign or be fired. And that took me all day to write that. And I didn't know whether I wanted to run it when I was done with it, but I thought I had to. I just felt very strongly about it. And I got strong reactions about it, both favorable and not favorable. So I knew it was a good column.
Jack was reading my mind because that was my next question. What column elicited the most anger from readers? And so that's kind of...
Oh, well, that one got some some very angry alumni talked to me about that. But the most negative response I ever got to a column was about 6 years after I started writing the column. I wrote a column about a woman who, she contacted me and she said she had a cat who had 4 litters of kittens in 1 year. And I thought, well, that's unusual. She thought it was unusual. So I just wrote it straight away. It was one of those columns that had maybe 5 or 6 items. And I just threw it in there. I got 33 letters. Now, this was in, I think, 1984, before email. So these were 34 letters, almost all for women, who sat down, wrote longhand letters, some typed, but most wrote in longhand, saying what a disgusting thing it was to not have that cat spayed. We had too many cats. That cat should never have had 4 litters, and I should never have printed it in my column. And take that, Scribbler.
Well, you make my point, because you are all over the map with your columns, and I can't believe that you wouldn't tramp on somebody's toes when you're walking all over the map. So, well, what about the story that you say that's the most, what's the most positive response? And is it by any chance the bamboo story that was just in the Penny Saver article that Ann B.
Oh, I mentioned the bamboo story. How many read the Penny Saver story?
There's an article in the Penny Saver just last week. So.
Well, not too many.
Okay.
Well, it was a couple friends of ours from our church in Lancaster told me about, on a Saturday, they had grown bamboo. They live in that section of, they lived in that section of Lancaster Township that's separated by Lancaster City. It's over along the Conestoga River, if you know what I mean, just east of Lancaster City. It's just a strip of really nice homes along the Conestoga River. And they started growing bamboo. Well, if you know about bamboo, you start growing bamboo. If you don't stop it the next year, it takes over. And it took over, so they started cutting down bamboo. And this one summer, they cut down a lot of bamboo. They cut down a pile of bamboo, something like, as I recall, 8 feet long and 6 feet high. Massive amount of bamboo. Oh, this was dead bamboo, not living bamboo. And then they set fire to it. Have you ever heard burning bamboo? Has anybody heard it? You have. 2 people have. You know, it's segmented, and as soon as enough heat gets into that bamboo, it blows out into the next segment. And it sounds like a gunshot. Now you can imagine, just imagine hundreds, if not 1,000 bamboo shoots a minute going off for maybe a half an hour. Bam, 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 bam. Well, the police showed up, the fire engine showed up, the neighbors came, everybody came. They were all out there, and they were never fined. They were just told never to do that again.
Well, there's probably wasn't an ordinance about burning bamboo in Lancaster Township.
No, there wasn't. You could burn along the Conestoga River. They could burn, and they just burned the wrong thing.
I may be belaboring it, but one or two more. Do you have any story that you know was impactful that resulted in substantive change? And if you're looking for some of these things, I might have added some of the things since I put you on the trail with some of these things. A story that you think that you wrote and that people might have had a change. Taking it from entertainment into a more intellectual. And if you haven't, you don't. To your defense, you don't know.
Two things come to mind. One is the Route 23 bypass thing that I mentioned. I wrote about that quite a few times, and I kept pushing it to make sure it was in front of people, because those thousands. If you're aware of what happened, it was killed because 1,000 Amish people showed up and stood up against it at a meeting, and that killed it. But it didn't stay dead, because the Chamber of Commerce and businesses in all along the line, including in New Holland, want that bypass, still want it today. It would be very convenient to run trucks up and down. It would and people who live between Leola and Bearville and New Holland along that road know that sometimes you have trouble driving up and down it, and some people would like a bypass because of that. Well, I swept all that aside and said that bypass would kill the valley. It would split Amish farms, which it would have. It would have brought more development and ruined the place. And I kept repeating that over and over and over again. And I made fun of one of our state senators who said, well, let's do this so that the Amish can move freely between their farms. Let's build the road up on an elevated bridge, the whole road, put it up 10 feet or 12 feet high. I forget how high it was. It was this idiotic idea to run this high-rise road, yeah, thank you, high-rise road across the county so that the Amish could get their buggies underneath and could go back and forth through their fields. So I like to think that that helped in some way influence the reason the road wasn't built. The other thing, one other thing quickly that I wanted to mention was, the massacre. When I started writing the massacre book, and when I first wrote about the massacre in my column, I had people coming up to me and saying, why are you bringing up that old history? We don't want to hear those negative stories. There was a lot of that. You wouldn't believe it. Almost to the point where I thought, why am I writing these columns? And why am I going to write this book if it is negative history? But it's important to Indians, and it's important to the rest of us because it's part of all of our history. And I don't hear that from people anymore. Maybe they just stopped talking about it. But now I hear positive comments. Like, it's important to talk about all of our history, including that part. So,
Finally, a recent column you wrote connected to Garden Spot Village. Sarah Jane Munschauer asked me to convey thanks for doing the column, that you apologize for being late. But you talked about the many factors that enhance living in Lancaster County. Let me just read a few. The fertile farmland, 425,000 acres of limestone-rich farmland, a quarter of which has been preserved for forever. Preserved farmland, more preserved farmland than any other county in the country. The Susquehanna River, the ethnic diversity, diverse groups, English, Swiss, German, Scotch-Irish, French, Welsh, and Africans, who were some of the wealthier owners of the previous designations there, were their owners, their slave owners. Many of these people, more than 5,000, have been refugees resettled by churches. 700 churches in synagogues, and that was in some years ago, and you think now the number might be over 1,000. Jack Luce's comment when asked about the Bible Belt in Lancaster County, where is it? He says, well, it's the buckle of the Bible Belt. The Chronicle of Philanthropy ranks Lancaster among the top third of the nation's countries in charitable giving, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a column that he wrote, I don't have the date on it, just a couple of weeks ago, that Sarah Jane had asked as a newcomer to Lancaster County, and what should they know? What should the people that move into Garden Spot Village, for instance, know about? And so that was a recent column that's informative. I put that in the category of informative. Just a little bit about, in our last 4 minutes, and we'll open up for a few questions. How do you view the place of history and heritage in today's society? Some of the things that you write about, where do you see it going? Do you see slippage, or do you think that if somebody writes about it just like they do about the massacre, that people come to their senses and say, we have to be sure we don't repeat the mistakes of history? So is it? I wrote the next comment was are things like STEM and the digital world, courses beginning in high school about STEM, digital world, social sciences, etc. Are they pushing history to the margins, or do you think there still is hope for people to be interested in history going forward?
Why don't you talk first about that? Because Chris has been the teacher.
Yeah, okay.
For a fact, the younger students, give or take at fourth grade, are given a very limited background in local history. It's been really minimized, and I know that because I've gotten involved in teaching parts of it. And that saddens me. And at the high school level, there's rarely a course in local history that's offered even as an elective. So I'm a colonial dame, which I'm not saying it to impress you, but my relatives go back to 1623. And the reason I joined colonial dames of the 17th and 19th century is because I wanted to promote heritage in Manor Township and Conestoga Township, and the only way to do it was to have your foot in the door. That's the way the world works. So I paid money, made sure my credentials are intact, and am lobbying, and somewhat successful even as we speak, to bring attention to the Native American heritage and the early colonial heritage of the Quakers, as well as James Logan and William Penn, back to the place where, yes, they made their money. Why else would we talk about it? And Manor Township is because that was to be the home of William Penn, which is now the Lancaster County Solid Waste Authority land. Oh, yay. So I'm working with a landowner who's reluctant to admit that he's probably owns the land that was Logan's Trading Post, which was run by Susanna and James, Jonathan, I'm sorry, Cartledge. Unfortunately, some of the land that might have been part of this is also owned by Brookfield Renewable. And because they're a utility and they're not based here, they're reluctant to have anybody on that land. And my original plan had been to make it into a heritage park with, appropriate signage around and indicating the history of Manor Township, Conestoga Township, the people that are involved in that. And you would think that would be a simple idea. Not true. And so my problem with Lancaster County is you have heritage, but you don't have any signage. You don't have any routes that are, made known. And when the Planning Commission, to their credit, did try to create a Conestoga Road tourist route, which would have begun at the confluence of the Big and Little Conestoga in Manor Township and go all the way to Philadelphia, the towns along the way did not want tourist buses running through their residential areas or municipal areas. So trying to explore and explain local heritage if the schools don't do it, and the county planners are reluctant when the municipalities push back, and like Manor Township doesn't have a historical society. Conestoga does have a building and a complex, and they do a good job. But the Lancaster Preservation Trust doesn't want to even do anything with Native American heritage, let alone colonial heritage. It has to be a built building that you can walk to and see. If you can't see it, then it doesn't exist. So that's one of the gaps that is very frustrating for people that want to bring the early colonial heritage back into recognition and are finding that it's just a big gap, perhaps a void that can't be filled.
We've come to the end of our time, and we do want to have a few questions from the audience, but I was going to ask you, but I'm saving you because of the time. I think when you write your memoirs, you have to have a hook to get somebody to buy that book. And so I think yours is, I saw stories where others merely passed by. Would you pay me for that byline?
I'll take it.
You didn't say, yeah, okay, you'll take it. I'll give it to you. So we thank them very much for coming and doing something they never did. And in the car ride in the Welsh Mountains, they were sure that this is really a bad idea. So what do you think? It's 8:03. We'll give time for a few questions. Anybody have a question that they were thinking about as the time went on? If you don't, it's okay. Over here is one down here. I'd say right there. We'll go ahead.
We hear a lot of stories about the people who came here from elsewhere, but we don't hear much about the people that we took the land from to be here. Why don't we hear more about the Indian or the people who we chased off of the place so we could live here?
May I answer that? Pennsylvania does not have any recognized tribes. So there's not a lobby group that would promote your idea. We both attend a group called Circle Legacy. They're a casual group. Their goal is education, but they have no political base because the state doesn't give them any. Yes, you can go to Columbia and visit Shawnee Run based on Shawnees. You can go to Conoy Township and have the Conoy Indians recognized. You can go to the Blue Rock Heritage Buildings Society, and you can have a wonderful experience learning about the Susquehannocks. And just outside that boundary, you could learn something about the Shanks Ferry Indians. So there are Native American heritage opportunities, but because they're not recognized by the state and the people are not able to lobby for themselves as a result, we don't hear, and therefore we don't know, and therefore we don't preserve or recognize the heritage, except in little doses, not connected.
A little dose would be the longhouse at Hans Herr House or something like that.
Well, that's a demonstration
Yeah,
site.
right. It's not, yes.
What I'm saying is, if you look at the concept of heritage planning from a county planning point of view, there is no county plan for such.
Any other, one more?
May I add?
Yes, yes, please.
Let me add one thing to that. Does Garden Spot Village have a land acknowledgement statement? That's one thing you could do here to acknowledge that the Indians were here first. Various schools, colleges,
Churches,
churches, other retirement villages have written land acknowledgement statements that they put on plaques, read at various meetings, and the statements are different. They all vary a little bit, but they say essentially this Indian, Susquehannocks were here first, or the Conestogas were here first, whatever. They were here before we were, and by repetition, people get the idea, yeah, we are on their land. Now, some people won't accept that. They think that's stupid. I've heard people say that's a stupid thing to do. But I don't think it's a stupid thing to do. And if anybody in here thinks it's a good idea, you could ask.
there are models,
What?
there are website models of language, wording, yeah.
Yeah, you can find it online.
I had an absolute end at 8:10. We got 3 minutes. One more question, maybe?
We actually have in our church bulletin a statement at the bottom of the bulletin recognizing them for being here and apologizing to them for taking their land.
Good. Glad to hear it. What church is that?
I don't think you need to apologize as much as just acknowledge, if I may say. Some people may say, that's too strong a word, apology.
Well, what church, would you mind saying what church it is?
Well, New Holland Mennonite Church.
Well, the Mennonites have taken the lead in apologizing for taking the Indians' land. Land acknowledgement doesn't need to go that far. It just acknowledges. But the Mennonites in this county, beginning over a dozen years ago, took the lead in apologizing for taking the Indians' land. So I figured that would be a Mennonite church.
Thank you very much for coming, and we thank the Brubakers again for being willing to kind of lay their life out in front of you for your benefit. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Went well.